This morning, we're talking with a veteran insider of DC. We've got David Fitzsimmons, who is the current chief of staff for Brad Finstad. Uh, in just out of course, he happens to sit in the seat that Tim Walz used to sit in. So, kind of timely as far as this election cycle, with Tim Walz being the vice presidential candidate on the Harris Walz ticket. David, I was wondering if you could just give us a quick introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your background and what you're currently busy working on.
Yeah, well, it's always funny now being described as an insider because I generally find myself in a place I didn't really intend to go. Most people that work in Congress set out to do so. They did internships, went to school in political science. Started when they were very young and kind of so-called work their way up or work up the ladder. And usually when a young person wants to talk to me about like how do you get to like a chief of staff role or a senior role in Congress, and I always kind of say like I don't think my life's probably much of a good
It's not
guide map for you.
not a replicable path. I remember when you and I first crossed paths like long ago. What was it? Almost 20 years ago now. Yeah. So it was kind of a different time in the world.
Yeah, and so my family's actually in agriculture. I live uh, just about an hour west of Minneapolis. So that may not sound like a lot, but especially 20 and 30 years ago, we were still very much in the country, and I grew up in a farm family and really kind of had every intention of having that be my life. Started getting involved in local politics, and then just kind of found myself in roles, and really kind of the proverbial one thing led to another type situation, and then Grant, you and I kind of really got to know each other. I was getting more involved in the state level, and then Tom Emmer was kind of my country neighbor out here in Wright County, and I helped him start his campaign for governor in 2009, and really was an unexpected Republican nominee when we won the endorsement in 2010, and
That was a really close election, if I remember. That was against Dayton, right? I mean,
yes,
that could have went to a recount if Tom
yeah,
won.
went to a recount. Was a grand total of just over 8,000 votes. I think like 8,100 votes. Which, when you look at, Minnesota has something like 4,200 precincts, I believe. So the smallest unit, township, or like a small part of a city, you're averaging less than 2 votes per precinct difference. So it was, basically the top two, closest statewide races, really in the last nearly 20 years now. So, and kind of got on that. Then I ended up running for the state legislature, was doing one term there, and then Tom Emmer's predecessor, Michelle Bachmann, announced somewhat suddenly, unexpectedly, I think, that she was not going to run for re-election. And so, I know Tom and I talked that early morning. I think it had come out basically overnight. So I think we talked at like 4 a.m. That was when he was doing a radio show. That was a morning show. And so I ran his campaign for Congress. That was in 2013-14. And then he had asked me to come out and be his chief of staff there. So built that office and kind of got involved that way. And then
was that the first time you had been the chief of staff for a congressional?
Yeah. It was actually only the second time I'd ever been to Washington, D.C. So, it was definitely a learning experience and learning on the run. But, from young age, I've been involved in planning and management and things like that, again, with like kind of the family business. And I've just kind of found that a lot of times, I think it's all like in the education world, those are called soft skills now. You just kind of learn you can transfer, a lot of life skills into a lot of different places. Then it just kind of becomes learning the terminology and the nuances of a new place. But so now I've been basically doing that for 10 years. I worked with 4 different members since then. So that's a nutshell, man.
Let's stay on Tom for just a second, because he's started to rise through the ranks now. He's kind of moving up to the top inside of Congress, right? He's got some special positions.
Yeah. So then he became, when I was with him, he became deputy chair of the NRCC, that's the National Republican Congressional Committee. So they're basically the campaign arm of the conference, which is both Democrats and Republicans have a conference, which is their members in the House of Representatives. And then both of them have a campaign arm.
Did that mean you got dragged into some of that stuff because you were his chief of staff, or is that?
Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of involvement then. So, really started to do a lot more around the country. So that happened in 2016. And then, so that of course was when President Trump was first elected president. So he ended up pulling, I believe, 4 members, if I remember correctly, out of the House in various positions in his administration. So one of the early things was there was a lot of special elections, and so I ended up being in because of Tom in those roles. We took some of our folks and went out and helped in some of those special elections. So that was Kansas and Montana and other places. So that was kind of a right away an early, kind of foray into outside of Minnesota, which I hadn't previously had. And then that's also, there was a race in Tim Walz's district at the time that he represented, that we really wanted to flip from blue to red. And the candidate, Jim Hagedorn, I'd run a couple times and got close, but wasn't, had not been victorious. And so we helped out a lot there. I ended up running that campaign. And so in 2018, we did flip that seat. And that was, if you remember, not a great year for Republicans. We, in fact, a large number of seats flipped from Republican to Democrat, and there were only 2 in the country that flipped from Democrat to Republican, and that was one of them. So, and then kind of spent some, came back to Minnesota, and then very quickly got involved with Michelle Fischbach, who I go way
Hold
back.
on a second. Hold on. We gotta go back to 2000.
Yeah. Like, sorry, just gotta push.
No. Just because this is fascinating, because this is when Trump is first getting elected, right? And he blows into Washington. Just nobody thought that was going to happen, right? I mean, you couldn't have been thinking that Trump was actually going to win that. Like, all the polls were saying he was going to lose. And what was it? Hillary thought she had it sewn up, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I definitely won't say like I was out there screaming that he was going to win, but I definitely was saying I think he might, and I think that's been one of the things, as well with being in Washington is, I go there during session, so I fly back and forth. Thankfully, Minneapolis is a kind of frequent connector with Washington, so it's pretty easy to get in and out. And but the nice thing is I get to kind of come back to rural Minnesota, and so I get myself out of the Beltway all the time. And so I remember talking to a lot of people in DC at the time right before the 2016 election and saying, like, I'm not sure he's not going to win. And I think
because you've got this boots on the ground connection with the national stage and with rural America, and so you're seeing the writing on the wall. You're saying, oh, I think he's got a chance to win this thing.
Yeah, I mean, you saw people doing the, the homemade signs, and I remember talking with Tom as we were driving around all the time, and we were kind of equating it with it had a little bit of this kind of Jesse Ventura for those in Minnesota who remember that. I should say those in Minnesota who are old enough to remember that happening. When he became governor, and really, it just was. It was very organic, and it was very, it just kind of had a feeling of picking up steam all the time.
What do you see right now? Do you see that same kind of energy? Do you have the same sense that that Trump's going to win it again? We've been looking at Polymarket a lot as far
Yep.
as a predictor. Polymarket's got Trump just blowing Kamala Harris out of the water. I mean, it's like 66-33 or something.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of it. It's different, and that's again what I think at some point kind of going through enough election cycles, there's things that are always there, and then but everything has a little bit different, flavor. It's like no two cycles are exactly the same. And I think like with this one, it's just uh people are where they are in a lot of cases, and I think in 16 there were a lot more people that were silent and think it was okay to say what they were thinking, especially Trump supporters. I think that's gone away in a lot of ways, definitely not completely, but I think he's got a lot of strength. And I mean, I agree. I think if you look at the polling, um, it looks close in a lot of places. Especially again when you're looking at the electoral college game, it kind of comes down to roughly 7, 8 states. So, and a lot of those are incredibly close. But I think a lot of people see the momentum as being behind Donald Trump rather than Kamala Harris.
She's pretty much got to win Texas to really not have to fight in a ton of places, and Texas is not going to go for Kamala Harris, right? I mean, that's no one seriously believes that, right?
Yeah, I don't really understand what that play is or if it's a real play. I mean, there's always a little bit of a game of are you able to, spread the field and kind of draw your opposition in places, kind of taking, you know, falling for the head fake, if you will. Um, but I don't see that. I think the map will look probably pretty traditional, but um, you know, I, I can also see you also have, in addition to the national poll being very close, a lot of these individual swing states are very close, and so it wouldn't take a lot of a late break either direction, and it would look in reverse like a landslide, even
So
though
so this
it
so the
doesn't necessarily
unity
feel like that.
so the unity ticket that Trump pulled together with Bobby Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard and a bunch of other people that he's managed to pull together. How's that playing? Like you're well inside. Is that viewed as a pretty positive thing, or like what does it feel like to you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and it goes a lot beyond that too. I mean, I think if you've watched some of what's happened with some of the trade unions that have been kind of unquestionably on the side of Democrats and on the side of especially the Democrat at the presidential level, and really kind of seeing some of the fraying that's going on there and the changes that are going on there, and some of it makes a lot of sense when you peel back the policy side of it. I mean, you have Democrats attacking Trump because of tariffs. Well, tariffs were generally always a thing that trade unions and quite frankly a lot of Democrats supported, and all of a sudden they're saying that's the worst thing in the world. Even though, as has been brought up many times, though they rail against the Trump tariffs, even though Biden for the most part, has not rescinded those. So, I think that's like shifted some of the traditional expected angles of things, and it really goes to Trump kind of being able to speak to that that middle class and that working class voter.
All right, so you're getting back to kind of the history of how you got where you're at. Now you're the chief of staff for Brad Finstad. I'm not as familiar with him as a congressman. So this is his first time, right?
Yeah, so it ended up, and it was obviously a very crazy situation because the Jim Hagedorn, who had then taken over the seat from Tim Walz, he passed away. He was having some health struggles, but I still think it came as a surprise that he passed away, and that happened in February of 2022. And because of the timing of that, it created a situation where there was essentially a special primary that happened in May. So really only a few months later. So it was really a snap, kind of a snap election, if you will. And then that general election took place in August. So he was elected in a special election in August of 2022, and then immediately was running for re-election in that November of 2022, where he was reelected. So he's serving his first full term. So he's basically been there for just over 2 years. But he was a former state representative in Minnesota. He was a appointee by President Trump for the Minnesota director of rural development under the USDA here. So a long time involved, someone I've known for a long time, and a really, really great guy. And he's doing a fantastic job, and obviously I anticipate him being reelected in a week here.
Yeah. So go ahead, Lucas.
Oh, David, you're in a position now. You've been with Brad coming in 2 years as a representative, and you've been there for several years. What sort of conversations do you have with a new rep as a chief of staff, and whenever you're preparing them for how to best to accomplish policy, or to get along, or to make change in Washington? Do you have a sit down conversation with them after they get elected, before they get elected? What does that look like for them?
Yeah. A lot of times before they get elected, you're not, I use a term, that's a Wednesday problem to describe things that you'll deal with after the election. You kind of have to focus on getting through Tuesday, getting through your election, and getting elected first. I do, when I sit down with people who are talking about running for Congress or talking about running for big races, try to have a very open assessment of what it's really like. I think, for one thing, people tend to see maybe more of the things that look, fun or interesting or exciting. And there's a lot of work behind the scenes. There's a lot of time commitment. There's a lot of, just struggles of life that come with that territory. So, kind of getting through that. But yeah, then once you're to Wednesday and you're after the election and you're elected, you kind of have to go through all the things that most people don't know. Most people that come to Congress don't have, previous experience at that level. There's, a few exceptions where, maybe someone was a chief of staff or in the administration or something like that, and they run. But, for the most part, these are people that, lived a life completely outside of Congress. So a lot of it is just tutorial about how things go, how you get on a committee, how you're going to hire staff, how you're going to work on what your priorities are. So yeah, there's a lot of fast education that takes place, and especially for someone who's just coming in, that's one thing as well. When you're thinking about Oh, I can't wait for this election to be over on Tuesday. For someone who just wins their first time, the kind of the fun has only begun. Then their holiday season is going to be consumed by a lot of adjustments and things they have to do.
You mentioned committees, and that was something I was very interested in. I know it's very well, sort of how the House accomplishes business is through committees.
Yep.
Are the committees maybe something that's aligned with the interest of a district, or do you? I also have an expectation that maybe a lot of reps who've been elected don't understand that and aren't thinking in terms of committees. Do they come to you and say, I want to be on this committee? Or is it something that you say, this is good for this is good for the district, or what are your interests and these committees would be ideal for you? Or is it something that that has a lot to do with the power struggles within the House? Like, how does that get meted out?
Yeah. So a little bit of it is all of the above, all the things you mentioned. And I would say this kind of goes into a wider approach I have. And I think for the most part, what kind of this role is a lot of times you're trying to lay out options and opinions on where things are and kind of work through those decision-making things. And so you want to talk about what the committee does, what its jurisdiction is, how that aligns with the district, what are kind of the dynamics within that committee, where that fits in their personal experience or interests, and coming up with that, because it definitely that's decided by a thing that's called the steering committee, which is for the most part sort of the senior members of the conference. So of your party's members, they're the ones that slot you in to your committees. And typically for most House members, that's around 2 committees. It can vary anywhere from 1 to 4. There's a few other factors that go into that, but it's not infinite, right? So you have to kind of figure out what you're asking for. And then you make that pitch to those members who are making that decision of where to put you. And there are opportunities to change that for the most part each Congress, or again, if vacancies take place and things of that nature. But a lot of it is driven by then the committee. That becomes the people that you're working with. That's that band of policy that's assigned to that committee's jurisdiction is really where a lot of the detailed work happens there. That kind of ends up dictating in a lot of cases what your bills and your legislative priorities will be, centered around your committee. And so it is a big part of what happens. But yeah, you don't just get to say, I want this or that. You have to work for it and show your competence in it and do the work.
And what kind of legal advice or legal staff do you have providing advice? You keep talking about jurisdiction, and I listen to reps make statements all the time, and I sometimes wonder if they think of the federal government in terms of its limitation of district. They're sending bills to the Treasury. They fund things. Is that passé? Am I living in the 19 or maybe the 1840s, or are they thinking about? Are they mainly focused on getting money to their districts or getting money to the causes that they are championing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're not wrong or not naive that there are a lot of legalities, dealing with everything that you do. And again, I think that's something that sometimes constituents don't think. They just they'll kind of act like you have some sort of unilateral governing authority as a representative member of a body like Congress, and of course you don't. You have to work within the confines of the laws that exist. Now you're a lawmaker, so you can change laws. There are mechanisms for that, but you do have to work within the confines of existing law. And there's also rules of the House, and so rules of the House are pretty traditional. They're readopted every time a new Congress comes into being. A lot of people probably kind of remember more than usual 2 years ago when we had a vote for speaker. That's the first thing you do, and the very next thing you do is adopt rules for the House. And that,
actually, I'm very curious about this. So we've had this situation where the speaker election was quite contentious and difficult. Can you speak a little to that? Because you actually saw that firsthand, right? That didn't seem anticipated, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat anticipated. It's not completely new. It's just always previous to that has been able to be dealt with, maybe sometimes narrowly, before it's kind of in full public view, which is sort of the first time that really the general public got to kind of see past that.
How the soup gets made. Usually,
how the soup gets made. It was
doors.
Yeah, so a lot of times that's already kind of taken place, and it's pre, negotiated and everything's happening, but you are up against the clock because when a new Congress comes in is in the Constitution, just like when there's inaugurations in the Constitution, like these are things that are kind of set in stone. And so and I think another new dynamic that wasn't always the case, but has definitely become more the norm, and I think is probably a good bet to make in the short term, is that narrow majorities have become more common, and so you really just don't have a lot of extra you don't have a big reserve of anything you can lose. And so people voting against the speaker of their own party is definitely not new. It just, you had a combination of that being such a small number that a small number, could thwart that and try to use it, as leverage. And that's what we all got. Everybody got a front row seat, because once it's on the floor of the House, then it's being broadcast.
And that we've actually seen this start to be the norm in Congress, I think, where because of these thin margins, how divided it is, the factions within the parties are starting to assert themselves more. I think that, famously, the Republican Party has had some of this happening, but definitely on the Democratic side now, with the move towards this progressive party that's kind of rolled into town with the presidential campaign that has happened in the past here, or even what was going on. Can you speak a little to that? Does it seem like Congress kind of almost has 4 different factions vying with each other right now?
Yeah, and in reality, probably more. And I don't think that's, should be a complete, shock to people, because there isn't always just some bright line on every issue that goes like, okay, well, 50% of the people say yes and 50% of the people say no, and that's it. There's a lot of gradations in opinions, and that may change from issue to issue. And so there are a lot of individual, takes on things. And then when you deal with a smaller majority, that gives a lot more leverage to a small number. If you have a 20 seat majority, then if you have 10 members that say, well, we disagree with the direction this is going, then the rest of them say duly noted, and they move on. And but when you have a 8 or 9 seat majority, then those 10 members say that you have to deal with that, because there's no way around it. So again, I think that smaller majority, and again, I think we saw it, that the Republican majority coming out of the 2022 election was actually the exact same number wise as a Democrat majority after the 2020 election. And it didn't quite make it to the point of the speaker situation, but there were a lot of times they had to pull bills. They would start a bill through the Rules Committee, which is, everything basically has to pass through Rules Committee according to House rules, unless you do a suspension of the rules, which has to get 2/3 of votes then on the floor. But there were bills that went to Rules Committee. They started to be debated. They're doing the whip counts, realize they don't have the votes. They have to stop it and go back and negotiating. And that happened a lot in 21 and 22, as well as now in this Congress. So not all of that is really new. I think it just, because of the speaker thing, I think it became more in the spotlight this time.
What about with the relationship between House and Senate politics? And what is the communication between reps of a state and the senators of a state? And I mean, also, I'm sort of thinking we're about to see a grand shift. Mitch McConnell is stepping down leadership. His leadership role in the Senate is there expectation of new alliances among especially Republicans in Washington, House members and senators, or is it just old hat and that's not that much of a big change?
No, there's always that dynamic with the Senate as well. There is communication all the time, but they are different entities. They have different rules. A lot of what really drives some of the difference is the Senate's filibuster rule. So in many cases, to do things in the Senate, you have to have 60 votes, 60% of the body, instead of where the House, for the most part, everything's a simple majority. So if you just have a majority of the people voting, you win, 50% plus one. And so if you're the majority party, for the most part, you usually can get what you want through in the House. That isn't necessarily the case with the Senate. And so the Senate, tends to be more pre-negotiated outcomes on the front end before they bring something to the floor. And so in a lot of cases, I think that's what leads to the final product often being closer to what the Senate put out. However, I think a lot of times the House is driving the conversation on things in the first place. And so that goes into that negotiation process.
And how about another big paradigm shift? Chevron Doctrine was repealed earlier this year. Is that our House reps and the House, are they slavering to have that have the power of more rulemaking handed back over to them? Is it not that much of a big deal, or what do they think about to repeal of Chevron?
Yeah, I mean, I think from Republican standpoint, they were very happy with that ruling, because I think a lot of what has been talked about for years is kind of a lack of oversight on the executive branch from the legislative branch. I think we've seen, I don't think it's anything new. I think it's happened over decades and decades of a strengthening of the executive branch, and often at the expense of the legislative. And I think that's happened at the federal level as well as in many states. And you see the growth of agencies, and then suddenly they're taking a very maybe a relatively broad scope of direction from the legislative side, from the legal side. And then, like you said, then they get into the rulemaking process, and there's often then not a lot of way to hold them accountable to what you felt was the intent from the legislative side. And now you're kind of way in the weeds that they've concocted in their in their rulemaking side, and it can become difficult for legislative branch to hold them accountable for that. So I think the Chevron doctrine being repealed kind of resets that to some degree, and hopefully leads to more oversight and more ability of the legislative branch to be able to hold accountable agencies, which at the end of the day are run by unelected, government bureaucrats.
Amen to that. There's also well, when I think about the autonomy of agencies and the fights between the legislative branch and the agencies under the executive branch, I'm thinking of Jim Jordan and the House members trying to get the actual audio files, not just transcripts and probably edited transcripts of interviews with the president earlier this year, and some of the pushback that happened there. When you are preparing or having a conversation with the rep, with any rep, what do you think about with these hearings? Because we often get the line pushed forward that this is that it's tantamount to a court proceeding, a finding of fact. But there are really hard limitations, especially with the amount of speaking time that a rep gets to push ideas forward. Like, how much preparation goes into that? Is the rep like largely in control, or are you guys really prepping them for getting some points across? And if so, also, is that to your constituency, or is it a conversation about affirming relationships or pointing out bullshit that's occurring with other members in the House?
Yeah, so I think for one thing, talking about like why are they happening, and I would say some difference between them and what you would think of as a normal court proceeding is these things are much more public, right? And so they're designed to be things that are done in front of people. And so going back to while there are legislative and legal reasons going on, there's also the public relations and the public education portion of that's taking place. You're raising issues that people may not really know the details of, and you are putting people. I mean, people are sworn in. There's oaths. I mean, you are dealing with a legal side too, where you can, you hear about things like contempt of Congress, where there are legal authorities for getting information, for compelling people to answer things that those hearings are for. And so it's a lot of education, but there is sometimes a legal side that's going along as well. As far as kind of what a lot of the message is, I mean, obviously you don't always know what the end of a fight is going to look like when you start at the beginning, but there is a lot of preparation. There's a lot of communication that goes into, because you're also working as a unit, and so kind of back to that committee discussion, because these hearings for the most part are being done with committees in the House. And so when you have your fellow members of your team's members in your committee, you're developing relationships with them. You have the communications lines with them, usually, being led by the chairman or the minority party is called the ranking member on these committees. They're kind of the quarterback of their side. And so they're trying to maybe use, repeated questions or interlocking questions. And then if they can get kind of a new opening, then they might adjust for a later, question, or how they're going to pursue a certain line of questioning on that.
Is there any member that comes to mind that you find stand out, that does it well?
Well, obviously you named Jim Jordan. I mean, he's definitely very skilled, at doing this. And yeah, I think I'd be hard pressed to think of someone who's better than that. Elise Stefanik has proved, very strong. I think if you remember back to some of the college campus takeover by, kind of the pro-Hamas wing of the Democrats, and how some of the administrations were dealing with that. She had a couple instances where she was really able to push some things that, in fact, it led to some resignations ultimately. So there are effects that do happen to these things. I mean, they may sometimes seem a little bit just like theater, but there are real things that come about. You're also a lot of times building your case and for legislation. You're saying, well, this is, we showed that this is a problem, and so now here's the legislative fix for it.
I like that you mentioned Elise Stefanik. She is on my radar. I sometimes think, especially with the ability to put hearings on 2X after they've already occurred, they're important to watch. Maybe a diminishing amount for the 360 million people here in the United States. But they are also a little bit entertaining. It's fun to see politics happen. Like, some people might want to watch some show on television, but I like to get on YouTube and watch me a House hearing every now and then.
The original reality TV.
I was hoping we could take this just a slightly different direction for a few minutes. Some people are calling this election cycle the crypto election cycle, where cryptocurrencies and people who have money are starting to really weigh in and kind of throw money around. I think famously we saw that the Winklevosses said they were going to donate like $1 million to Trump's campaign, and then we both Lucas and I looked at that and we're like, aren't there campaign contribution limits? What's going on here? But regardless of whether they were actually successful in getting that money through, it seems like there's some assertion of this type of influence within politics. Are you seeing that? Is it resonate that this is the crypto election?
Yeah, that's definitely out there. And to answer your question, or your correct notation of there are contribution limits, a lot of that is worked around through independent expenditures, IEs. So there are ways to have entities that you're created that you don't have any contact with the campaign, but you are legally set up to influence that election, and they have very different limitations or lack thereof of their fundraising side. But yeah, there's no doubt that that's become an increasing component in the election, and in this election, and probably in the past few, kind of working its way up. And I don't think
really? You're saying that's already been occurring. Like, this isn't even new.
It's not new. I think it's probably that it's more. So it's reached that first, or it's kind of broken through. I mean, you're always saying, I'll tell you, it just within the last year, all of a sudden, I've met a number of people, or people I knew already, that are now working for things associated with AI that, I would have never expected 2 years ago. And so, anytime a new, broadly termed industry or interest is coming into being, they're going to want to be involved in what's happening on the political and the policy side, because
this one seems slightly different though, because you had Bobby Kennedy delivering speech at Bitcoin Nashville. He made some pretty strong statements about what he thought needed to occur. You've got Donald Trump talking about strategic reserve. We've got various different members of the House and the Senate talking about ways that they want to utilize Bitcoin or different types of crypto to do certain things. You've got legislation being put forth to say that there's mining bills of rights and custodial bills of rights, and then you've got Elizabeth Warren kind of fighting against what's his name, Lucas? I'm forgetting who Warren is warring against there. John Deaton.
Yeah, John D.
Yeah. So it just seems like it's more. It seems like there's a lot more. I mean, I get maybe it's not new, but just like the sheer bulk of it seems pretty impressive this time around.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And wasn't saying otherwise. It's not come from nowhere, but it's definitely moved up a lot of notches. And kind of getting to sort of in the same way that the reason I kind of brought up AI is like it, well, any interest or any industry is always going to have a concern with what's going on a policy side and legislative side. When something new is going on, it's all the more so, right? Because there are a lot less things that have been decided, and so you're really still in that, deciding stage on a lot of these issues. And I mean, with crypto in particular, I mean, there's not even a clear-cut answer on what it is exactly, right? There's some people deem it, a lot of times it's called cryptocurrency. Well, is it currency? Because currency has specific legal, legal definitions and legal repercussions to those definitions. Is it a commodity? Well, again, there are things that come into play when you call something, when something's legally defined as something. So I think there's a ton of questions still out there about crypto. And so to me, it'd be no surprise that they're going to want to have people that they believe, understand their issue in those rooms that are deciding what's going on.
So how much like need is there still within the world of politics and Congress to try to get more clarity and understanding of this kind of stuff? And how, as the chief of staff, like how do you think about getting that access to that knowledge? I mean, help us understand that a bit better, because it sounds like there's still room for opportunity within the world of crypto to help Congress understand what this is and how it works.
Yeah, I mean, and I think sometimes what you're battling is that there's a lot of people are trying to, educate members on many different things. And so
lobbyists.
Yeah, and I know that term is used in a very, pejorative way oftentimes, but the reality is most people in probably multiple ways are represented by lobbyists, whether that's through the business that they have, the employer that they work for, or interests that they agree with. And it is a way of you having to try to figure out how you can present to members and staff that are all dealing with finite amounts of time and bandwidth. I think it's definitely, after working with a few members, it comes across oftentimes early on, or maybe a little past the early on, but relatively early on, where it kind of dawns on them like, I feel like I'm getting whiplash, right? Because you're talking on so many different subjects so quickly that you almost have to retrain your brain a little bit to be able to like focus in on what's being talked about, because you have a meeting and you're talking, like you said, you're trying to educate yourself on crypto, so you got 25 minutes that you're doing that, and then your next meeting is on cheese, and you gotta like, you gotta shift your brain. And then the next one is on automaking. And I think that's kind of you're always having to figure out how can you try to get a little piece of that bandwidth to make sure you're being heard and understood.
So Tom is way in front on crypto. I think he's been huge on this, right? He's
Yep.
he's talking about it. So was it during your time with him that
Yeah,
he sort of
so
really
it
got
was.
educated?
There was, and this was kind of a thing where it was, came up a few times early on. Then we had um, a staffer that was kind of into it, and so that became kind of an office conversation, and had ideas of how to engage there. And then this goes back to, I think, our previous, anybody who's made it this long in the podcast on committees. We had got Tom on the financial services committee. So, we were also looking for, okay, well then what kind of financial services related topics, can he engage on? And then also being on the newer side, you're also looking at, okay, well, where can I engage that isn't sort of a saturated market yet, because when you're kind of assessing where you can have an impact, there's sometimes only so much room for people who are kind of a leader on that.
The cheese area is already well marked out. It's long traveled, so trying to break into cheese is tough. Crypto is easier.
Yeah, at the time, maybe not anymore, right? Everything's time comes and goes. But and it's not, and it's that's the other thing too. Congress is never, it's never frozen in time. It's always moving. It's always changing. Members are coming and going. Majorities are rising and falling. The issue set moves. Different administrations. So with kind of back in a current situation with Congressman Finstad, he's become more involved with cybersecurity issues, and that's kind of come a little of his he's on the agriculture committee. He's a farmer by trade. He's been involved in ag policy a long time. He's also on the armed services committee, and so that's in charge of our national defense from the House side. And so there's a lot of concern over essentially warfare being fought cyber.
Well, let me ask you this question, since we're starting to stray into national defense, but we were just talking about crypto. Well, there's actually an intersection there. I don't know if you're but like David Lowery wrote that book Software, which is starting to get some amount of traction. I think Bobby Kennedy, again, harkening back to that Bitcoin Nashville, he talked a lot about it. Like how much are you hearing about software? Is that part of the conversation?
Definitely. And that's where it was kind of, going along that path. And the reason I brought it up is also one of the reasons why we kind of saw it as an opportunity for getting him more involved, both from the tie-in of like food security and technology, national security. Was also, there was a congressman who had announced just last year and left Congress, Mike Gallagher out of the Green Bay area of Wisconsin, he had kind of pulled together sort of a niche of being sort of the cybersecurity guy. So then when he was leaving, we were like, hey, maybe that's a thing that Brad could do. So you kind of always have to be, watching for those things. But yeah, on a wider issue, I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about with Congressman Finstad is look no further than what happened with the airlines and the calamity that ensued because of their something that was in no way really a physical problem. It wasn't like planes broke down. It wasn't even a storm. It was their employee tracking system then had a glitch. That wasn't even an attack. It's just a failure of of internal protocols maybe. But that was something.
Are you talking about CrowdStrike? What happened with CrowdStrike?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, you look at that, that impact that had on really kind of crippling air travel nearly completely for a week, which is And then just the ancillary impacts and the chain reactions that causes. So going back to, and this is something that's not, again, wasn't even an intentional act, but it shows, I think, as more things become, dependent on technology, that danger is there, right? Where if something happens, and I guess even to the point of going back to crypto, and look, we find you get reminded of this every time. I mean, people were talking in the, things in Asheville and Western North Carolina. They're like, I can't get my money. I don't have anything, right? Like people have entered a kind of a world where, carrying around cash or having physical objects, in this on-demand kind of just-in-time mentality isn't there. So, it becomes all the more important of you can really get knocked down, especially when you start thinking about what could a technologically advanced adversary bring to bear on our country.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Well, David, this has been a fascinating show. I don't know if you have a little bit more time or if we got to roll out right at the top. Like, what are your thoughts there? You got a few more minutes, or do we need to wrap it up?
I got probably a couple more minutes, but yeah, probably pretty soon.
Well, I'll be respectful. I'll be respectful of your time. This is usually the time when we roll out and the show, so no worries on that. We'll kind of wrap it here, but this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for kind of giving us a little insight into what it's like to be in DC, your insights into what you think this election cycle is going to look like. We're definitely going to be watching very closely over the next week to see how the election shapes up, and hopefully we'll be in touch and looking to see you back in DC again, hopefully, right?
Yeah. Would love to have you out sometime, Grant, and Lucas as well.
All right. Hey, that we'll consider that an invitation, but we'll see you tomorrow on FoMO.
Thanks for coming on, David. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, guys.